Does one have an obligation to live in the land of Israel? Does one have an obligation of Aliyah, of Ola, and the word Ola Rego, going up to Eretz Israel? So clearly the Torah tells us, the Ramban points out, that there's a mitzvah to inherit the land, to conquer the land, and to live in the land. So it's clear, according to the Ramban, that there is a mitzvah to live in Eretz Israel, and the Ramban says even Bizman Hazeh. And as well, there is Tosfos at the end of Ksuvas, and Daf Kuf Yud Amud Beis. Tosfos writes that Bizman Hazeh, and that's during his time, there is no longer a mitzvah to live in Eretz Israel because of the sakana, because of the danger involved, sakanas drachim, the danger involved in traveling to Israel, and as well the difficulty in fulfilling the mitzvahs hatchuyas ba'aretz, the difficulty in fulfilling the mitzvahs that are dependent on the land of Israel, the agricultural laws. So that was the question asked to Rav Moshe Feinstein in the early 1950s, that there's a major dispute between the Ramban, who says it's a mitzvah chiyuvit, there's an absolute obligation to live in Israel, like you have an absolute obligation to eat matzah on Pesach, to shake the daled midim on Sukkot. According to the Ramban, you have a definite, absolute obligation. On the other hand, we have the Bali Tosfos, who seem to say the mitzvah no longer exists today. So, how do we paskin? That was the question asked to Rav Moshe Feinstein. So Rav Moshe answered, even though many authorities, many of the poskim go with the Ramban, nevertheless, he says, he doesn't think there's an absolute obligation. He quotes from the Rambam. The Rambam writes in Hilchos Malachim, Perek Hey Halacha Tes, chapter 5, Halacha 9, that it's usher to leave Israel, but does not state that one is prohibited to reside outside Israel. He writes about the Isser of leaving Israel, but doesn't talk about the Isser of living. In fact, he says, Mutta lishcham achol ha'olam chutz mitzrayim. So, if there's an absolute obligation to live in Eretz Israel, Rav Moshe says, the Rambam would have recorded as well a prohibition to live outside the land of Israel. Based on this, Rav Moshe concludes, he says he wants to take a middle approach. According to the Ramban, there's a chiyuv to live, there's an obligation that everyone has to live in Eretz Israel. According to Tosfos, there is no obligation, there is no mitzvah today because of the sakanas drachim, the dangers of traveling, or because of the difficulty of keeping trumas and maises. However, the Rav Moshe takes a middle approach, that there is a mitzvah today. If one moves to Eretz Israel, if one lives in Eretz Israel, he's mekayim, he fulfills the mitzvah min Torah of living in Eretz Israel. However, there is no chiyuv to go. If you don't go, there's no prohibition, but if you do go, you get a kiyum ha-mitzvah. Where else do we have an example that a person can fulfill a kiyum ha-mitzvah without having a chiyuv? That's what they quote in the name of the Vilna Gaon and the Meister Rav, and the other poskim, the Mishnah and others quoted it as well, that although on the night of Pesach we know we have an obligation to eat a matzah, the Vilna Gaon writes that this mitzvah applies throughout Pesach. No wonder the Tziv writes about even the first night of Pesach, that each kizai you should eat, you can get another kiyum ha-mitzvah. And the Gemara even says the whole Pesach, because it says, on one hand it says, be'erev tochu matzos, the night of Pesach. On the other hand it says that we have the 7 days to eat matzos. So the Gemara says, the first night the chiyuv, and the rest of Pesach you get a kiyum ha-mitzvah. In fact, that's what someone who explained, there's a major machokes, the Rambam and the Ramban regarding the mitzvah of tefillah, of prayer. The Ramban writes it's biblical, and the Rambam holds it's biblical, and the Ramban holds it's biblical, it's rabbinical except the Eisara. So it's a whole discussion, according to the Ramban, that perhaps if salvation gets into it, maybe you could have a kiyum ha-mitzvah min Torah. If you do daven, you get a kiyum. Maybe the machlokas is arguing whether there's a chiyuv or not. But either way, that's what Rav Moshe writes regarding in his tshuva, that he thinks today it's a mitzvah kiyumis, that one doesn't have an obligation, but if one goes, he fulfills the mitzvah. Another example we find perhaps is by the mitzvah of tzitzis. There is no obligation to wear tzitzis. The obligation is if you're wearing a 4-cornered garment, you're obligated to put tzitzis on. But if one's not wearing a 4-cornered garment, technically speaking, there's no mitzvah. So that's what our minhag is. We go out of our way to wear a 4-cornered garment so we can fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis. And in fact, that's what the Gemara tells us in Sota, the same concept. Moshe was mitzdayer to fulfill the mitzvahs hatruyas v'ha'aretz. Moshe wanted to go into Eretz Yisrael because he had a strong desire to live it, to fulfill the mitzvahs hatruyas v'ha'aretz. So the question is, what's he getting all worked up about? He's in Chutz Ha'aretz, he doesn't have the mitzvah, so what's he worried about? If he was in Israel, okay. So we see from Moshe Rabbeinu, we learned the attitude that Moshe Rabbeinu desired to be in the land of Israel in order to be able to fulfill more mitzvahs. So we should always try to put ourselves in a situation where we should be able to fulfill as many mitzvahs as possible. In fact, we even have on the negative side that one should, not in addition, not only should one put themselves in a position to fulfill as many mitzvahs as possible, but it also works. You should put yourself in a position where you have to avoid, needless to say, if you have an Indian to fulfill more mitzvahs, you should definitely not put yourself in a situation where it might lead to doing averas. And the Machoket, famous dispute, the Ramban Balamor regarding Milah, we don't have it today, but the Mishnah says in Shabbos, ben milosneha milah ben la'achara milah. There's a mitzvah to wash the katan before and after the circumcision, and it's for sakana. It's for save the child from sakana. So bismana said we don't use the water because we have other medications we use which are better. But bismana Mishnah, Bismana Gemara, when they had it, so it was, if you didn't wash the child, you were putting the child in danger. So they point out, what happens if you did the bris and then the water spilled? So of course, the child's in danger. You make sure you get a guy, or depending on the situation, make sure you get, if you're the only one around, then you have to heat up that water to in order to save the child. What about the following? What happens if you spilled the water before you did the bris? That's a famous machlokes, the Ramban Balabor. The Ramban writes, you do the mitzvah in its proper time, and that's it. We don't make any cheshbonos. The Torah says on the 8th day you do milah, and therefore that's what you do. According to the Baal Mor, no. You don't put yourself in this situation. You don't put yourself in a situation where you know you're going to have to be Machal Shabbos. Of course, it's not really being Machal Shabbos, you're allowed to. So either way, so we see, not only you avoid a situation of an Isser, but you try to put yourself in a situation where you do as many mitzvahs as possible. And therefore, that's how Rav Moshe writes, there's a Kiyam HaMitzvah, so one doesn't have an obligation to move to Eretz Yisrael. However, he has a mitzvah if he does. That's the opinion of Rav Moshe. The Tzitz Eliezer and Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, he seems to take into account, it's interesting to note, Rav Moshe wrote the Tshuva in 1952, after Medina Yisrael, after the Jews got the state of Israel. So Rav Moshe doesn't seem to weigh that in. I mean, whether Rav Moshe thinks it's a good thing or bad thing, he doesn't discuss, but he doesn't take now that the Jews run Eretz Yisrael, now you have a bigger mitzvah. So Rav Moshe just seems to say it's a mitzvah kiyumis. On the other hand, the Tzitz Eliezer writes, he very much takes it into his cheshbon. He points out as follow on the English. And he has a whole sefer, Hilchos Medina, where he basically shows how you could live with the state of Israel in harmony with halacha. So either way, so he writes, with the establishment of Medinas Yisrael, the obligation to make Aliyah has become magnified. And therefore, as he points out, even the reasons Tosfos, and that's well before Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer said during his time, the reasons of Tosfos don't apply. It's not dangerous anymore, and certainly not then. Now with planes and everything, it's very easy to get there to Israel. And today with the chief rabbi and now, we don't have to worry about Trumas and Maisas. And therefore he says, this element definitely warrants consideration. And when Tzitz Eliezer speaks, he talks about it as a central and fundamental mitzvah. And he compares it to a children returning to the mother's embrace. So Tzitz Eliezer makes a big issue over that it's post-1948, where Rav Moshe seems to regard a mitzvah aliyah no different than any other mitzvah. He doesn't seem to give the same credence that the Tzitz Eliezer gives. And that's what others point out. Rav Shechter, he thinks most Achronim conclude, like the Ramban, that one has an obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael. And they all quote, and many learn the Rambam differently than the way Rav Moshe learned the Rambam, that they learned the Rambam's opinion is, like the Ramban, that it's a biblical mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. How come he doesn't count it? So that's the whole discussion. You have the whole gamut. He doesn't count it because he doesn't think it's a mitzvah. It's only a mitzvah midrabanan. The Megillas Esther, that it doesn't apply today. But he likes Rav Shechter likes the answer of the Avnei Nezer, that he says the Rambam already did count it, but he counted it elsewhere because the Rambam gives us the principle. He says that any mitzvahs that I counted before, I'm not going to count again. So where do we find him counting the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael? Because it's a mitzvah of Hachrim Tachrim, destroying the 7 nations of the world. You go into Eretz Yisrael and you throw them out. What's the mitzvah? Throw them out and live in New York, live in LA, live in Toronto? No. The mitzvah is to throw them out and move into Eretz Yisrael. The Ram already counted that mitzvah, therefore there's no need to write it explicitly. So that's how many learn that the Ramban, like the Ramban, and therefore even today is a mitzvah chiyuvas. That's a machlokes among the Gedolei HaPoskim today. And as they point out, no matter what, we see from all the Chazals and the Gemara and Ksubis, Kuf Yud Aleph, Kuf Yud Beis, etc., they extol the great mitzvah living in Eretz Yisrael. And that's what they point out, and we know that's the Mishnah that's grounds for divorce. That we see that if one spouse refuses to move to Eretz Yisrael, they're considered responsible for breaking up the marriage, and therefore, if it's a wife who refuses, then she wouldn't get the ksuba. Or we find in Gemara and Erev and other places about Amiru and Nachri, that we permit, the Gemara in Gin and Daf Ches, that we permit Amiru and Nachri because Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah rabbah. And therefore, as we know we have different levels of Kedusha. We have Kedushas HaMakom, the Beis HaMikdash, the Beis Knesset. We have Kedushas HaZman, Shabbos and Yantiv. So just like Rav Aaron Lichtenstein points out, that just like a Jew would be in pain if you didn't have Kedushas HaZman, if we didn't have a Shabbos and Yantiv, we'd be lacking, so too we should feel the same. We should feel as well we're lacking the same way if we can't fulfill our mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael and enjoy being within the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, an extreme presence, as the Gemara says in Ksubah. So to summarize, we have a major machlokas in the poskim. Obviously, Rav Moshe, Ramban writes it's a mitzvah chiyuvis. Tosafos says we're exempt, and we have Rav Moshe in the middle, and the poskim take different sides. And again, even if you hold it's a mitzvah chiyuvis to live in Eretz Yisrael, so obviously there are different exceptions to the rule in terms of finding a spouse, a parnasa. In other words, you're obligated, you have to live a normal life. If you can't find a Rabbi in Eretz Yisrael, you can't find a spouse. So all those are built in, that it's almanas nasa, obviously, that if you can't live a normal life, so then one would not have an obligation to go. And there are, as always, there are different exceptions to the rule, but the rule is that according to many today, there's a mitzvah chiyuvis, others say it's a mitzvah kiyumis, and even if you assume it is a mitzvah, even if you hold in theory like the Ramban, if you need a Rebbe, a spouse, a parnasa, so then those are many things that preclude someone, if it is, I'm not saying it has to be, but if it is, then there would be reasons why one would not be obligated to live in Eretz Yisrael.